All right. Well, I'm having a little bit of issue getting things going, but I think we're good to start now. We're going to start voting and participation, uh, political participation and elections. Today, we're going to start talking about campaigns um, as the front end of the election uh, and voting, right? Campaigns are really fairly easy things to get a handle on. We're going to talk about a couple of them, but for the most part, a campaign is simply how we in other countries start the process to getting a candidate uh, into elected office, right? And so in the U.S. and in Texas, we run two different types of campaigns. Candidates will first run what we call a nomination campaign. That's the campaign that they're running within their own party to try to become that party's nomination for whatever office they're seeking in the general election campaign. So for Texas, right, those nomination campaigns are referred to as party. Drawing a blank this morning. Um, your party nomination, right? We run those in March. We just had ours in Texas, right, the first week of March, and so the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, which are the two largest parties in Texas, and they run party competitions. All the candidates for office were running within their party to get nominated by their party, right? So um, if you're paying attention to any of I'll take the U.S. Senate elections for Texas senators. Um, right, we had Republican Party primary for Paxton and Cornyn. Right, were the two Republican nominees. Cornyn being the incumbent, and the party primaries. And there was a third, which I don't remember his name right now, but so right, neither one of those won outright. And so we're going to have a runoff, right? The third candidate in the Republican Party, right, is now kicked out. And so we'll have a runoff between the two Republican that want this nomination. On the Democratic side, we had Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico running for the Democratic nomination for senator from Texas. And Tallarico, right, narrowly defeated Jasmine Crockett, so he won the party's nomination, the Democratic Party's nomination, and will be on the general election ballot this coming November. Uh, whichever on the Republican side, whichever Cruz or I'm sorry, Cornyn or Paxton wins their runoff, they'll be the Republican nominee that's on the ballot. So your first type of campaign is the candidate you're gonna engage in is going to be a campaign to win your party's nomination for the office that you're trying to get. The second type of campaign you're going to run is once you become your party's nomination, you will start a general election campaign where you're now competing against other political parties' uh, nominees, right? So that's going to be an inter-party competition, whereas the party primaries are an intra-party competition. And so right, we go through this two-step process. So at first you're running this nomination campaign. And you've got to start planning this out, right? You got to start as a candidate. If you want to win, right, one of these primaries, you've got to start working at least a year or so ahead of time, right? Putting together a campaign strategy of how you're going to raise money, how you're going to use that money to purchase media coverage, and how you're going to uh, put yourself in front of the media to try to generate political momentum, first within your party, later within the state as a whole. And so you've got to manage these three M's of political campaigning: money, media, to generate momentum. And how you put that together is the campaign strategy that we will talk about for these candidates, right? That as pundits and such, and we'll be focused on them saying, are they doing a good job? Are they doing a bad job? Are they have enough money? Are they running out? Are they having trouble raising money? Are they spending that money in the right places? Is it generating good coverage for them? And so this is a lot of background work that has to go on between the candidate and the staff that they pull together, so that they can kind of manage their campaign, first to hopefully win their nomination, and then second to win their general election. It is a very expensive, it is a very long process. Um, if you are someone that is new to politics, it's going to be a very, very difficult process. In this case, right, if just talking again about this uh, one competition here, right, the senatorial competition, all four of these major candidates, right, two for the Democrats, two for the Republicans, are already established political candidates in the state, right? So you had um, Talarico serving as a Texas House rep who's now trying to move up to a U.S. Texas senator. You had Jasmine Crockett serving as a U.S. House member. Cornyn is your current U.S. senator from Texas, and Dan Paxton is the Attorney General for the state of Texas. So none of these are new candidates, right? They already know what the process is, what the campaign process is. They already have money on hand. They've been raising money. They already have a dedicated base of voters that know who they are. So they're certainly going to spend some time and effort trying to get their name recognition further out into the media. But for the most part, they get to kind of skip the initial steps that a new candidate goes through, which is trying to get people just to recognize who they are, recognize what office they're running for, so that when people see them on the ballot, they go, oh, I know who that is. That's probably not going to be, the case here. Most of us, right, probably if we're paying attention to any politics at all, know these candidates. And so when we see them on the ballot, we will know who they are and what they're running for. So they're not going to spend their money like a new candidate would on just trying to get name recognition built up. They're going to jump right into spending money on campaign strategy versus their opponent. And so the parties that support these candidates will be spending money on their behalf. They'll be helping them plan their campaigns. They will be trying to ensure that these candidates have the best ramp up to getting elected in November to come the general election in Texas. Um, but usually it's a very long process. It takes several years. These candidates have already put those years in, and so we're not having to go through that on this one. But whether we're looking at city elections or state elections or even national elections, all of this is a long process that requires you to really think through what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and plan this out. Um, the United States and the 50 states, right? We're rather unique in that we have these very long, lengthy campaigns, expensive campaigns. A lot of other countries are, spend a month or two at it, and candidates, most of them their parties are working on their behalf, and they're spending money on them, getting their names out, getting them recognized. As I have here on the slide, right, Great Britain moves through this whole process in establishing a new federal government, right, their national government, and it's a 5-week process. Um, so it's not that it can't be done faster. It's not that it can't be done cheaper. It's that this is a peculiar kind of institution in the United States and also in Texas that we as voters expect to see them working, candidates working to earn our vote. And we expect our candidates to put forth the time, the effort, and the planning so that we can see who they are and how effective they might be once they get elected. Uh, I'll jump out of state politics for a second and just ask you to think about Donald Trump, right? I mean, as you know, he ran for president and won in 16, lost in 20, he got reelected in 24. If you think back to what was going on, he effectively started his campaign to reclaim the presidency as soon as he was out of office and right. So he kind of ran a 4-year campaign for president. That's not usual, but it's not unusual to see presidential candidates doing a year and a half or 2 years. And that kind of sets us at odds with a lot of other countries. Again, at the state level, a year is very common for the planning and the work that goes into running a statewide election in Texas. It's a big state. There's a lot going on here. It takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time. If you're running for a Texas House district or Texas Senate district, it doesn't have to be as long. You don't have to raise as much money because the geography that you're looking to work through and to campaign in is a much smaller area. So you can buy, media in a smaller market. You can travel to closer places, right? So it's the scale matters. And so for Texas, we in our statewide campaigns, those offices where people are going to be elected by the whole state or representing the whole state, um, it's a long, expensive process, and you're traveling all over the state. So, um, yeah, it's quite the chore. Now, one of the interesting things before I move on to delegates, one of the interesting things about that though, is we ask candidates, what do you want to do? How do you want to do this? Is this the process you want? And quite often, candidates actually prefer more opportunities to engage. They prefer a longer process. They tell us that proving that they can work and organize and raise money and manage a long campaign process proves that they'll be up for, all right, the job that they're trying to get elected for. So in some sense, we see that coming from the candidates as well, supporting this longer process. One thing that you need to understand that's going on, especially behind the nomination campaigns, is this is the same time that political parties are picking their delegates that are going to be eventually, if it's a presidential election coming, uh, 9 or 6 months after that primary, right? We're picking delegates at the state level to actually ramp that up from precinct to county to state to eventually national conventions and send delegates from our state to the Electoral College. So, kind of as an aside here, right, you need to know that behind this nomination campaign period and the primary that leads to, we're parties are picking delegates, right? They're helping to figure out who it is that's going to represent their party. If, again, for a presidential campaign, if their party's nominee for president is the one that wins in their state. So In Texas, right, for the last several elections, certainly it's always been Republican delegates that are being uh, that are looking to go forward to the Electoral College and cast their vote for president. But the process that the parties start behind the scenes is teed off when we do these primaries, right, in March. And so um, now this primary, right, we don't have a presidential election happening in the fall, so we're not doing the delegate selection. But in 2 years, when right, we'll have presidential candidates running and doing primaries within the states, we'll be doing this delegate selection process behind the scenes. And so if you're someone that's interested in what's going on in Texas politics and who it is that's going to be actually casting votes from the state of Texas for president to select the president, right? This is the process that is happening behind the scenes, and so uh, those parties are holding meetings starting at the primary period and moving forward every couple months to pick delegates and move them from, right, we pick delegates to precinct level at the party, and then those precincts, right, we narrow those down for a representative to the district, and then we narrow it down again to representing the state. And then there's the final selection of delegates that's going to represent the state to the national convention and to the electoral college. And so those folks are behind the scenes as they're being selected out are helping to organize the political parties and organize the message of those political parties. When we get to the chapter on political parties, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want you to know that that delegate process is happening at the same time. Um, in Texas, our nomination process completes itself with a party primary. The party primary is the newer vehicle for selecting candidates within the party. It works just like a regular election works. You go to a polling place, and you're going to declare at that polling place in Texas, you're going to say, I would like to vote in the Republican primary, or I would like to vote in the Democratic primary. And then you'll get a ballot that corresponds to that choice, and that all of the candidates on that ballot will be candidates that correspond to the party primary you selected to vote in. Um, so if you had shown up at the beginning of March and you went to the primaries and you said, "Hey, I'm a Republican," when you were getting, checked in to vote in the primary, they would have handed you a ballot that had only Republicans on it. And conversely, if you just said Democrat, you'd have got a ballot with just Democrats on it. Not all states do it that way. So it is important to know the way that Texas does it. Um, we are Uh, well, we'll talk about the three different kinds of primaries in a moment, and explain which Texas is and how it works. There is another type of process that's a more historical, older process called a caucus, that political parties in some states still use to select their candidates, nomination candidates. So in those states, you don't go to a polling place and get into a poll and cast a vote privately, right, with a machine and blah, blah, blah. You actually have a public meeting in your precinct, and everybody shows up at the precinct meeting, and you have public discussion, public debate, and then public vote. And that's how you cast your votes in a caucus. This used to be the dominant method of doing primaries work across the states, but it's an older system, and it's been replaced with our primary process that we use in Texas, and most other states have moved to it as well. Um, so you could see, if you move to another state, a caucus process that's going to be a much more public experience in selecting candidates for the party. Um, but here in Texas, you'll do that in the privacy of a voting booth. Um, Things to understand about these campaigns, and this applies to both nomination campaigns and election campaigns is that they actually uh, probably don't have the impact that you think about. Most of the time, when we see candidates and they're talking to people and they're trying to present their case and say, "Here's who I am and here's what I want to do," our perception is that they're trying to convince people to vote for them, and that's true. Um, but additionally, we tend to think, well, they're trying to get people that are maybe for the other party or get people that are not committed to their party or not committed to any party to come to their side to support them. And our research into campaigns and the effects of campaigns tells us that that's not quite what happens most of the time. The most prevalent thing that goes on, the most prevalent effect of a campaign is that it's reinforcing uh, people's preferences that they already have. So most of what's going on is that when a candidate is, say, in Texas, running for their primaries, trying to get their party nomination, and they're out campaigning and they're speaking to people and they're trying to get their message out, the voters themselves already probably know um, what it is their party stands for, and therefore assume that this candidate stands for those same things as well. And so they're looking for the candidate to reinforce that that's the truth, right? That they do um, stand for what the party stands for and that you can support them as a party member because they're a member of the party and they actually have the party perspective as their primary perspective. So most of the true impact of a campaign is this reinforcement impact that tells party stalwarts, people that are right supporting the Republican Party or supporting their Democratic Party, that this candidate is one of them, does belong to the party, does for the most part stand up for the same values and policies and perspectives that the party does. And so most of us probably aren't thinking that that's what is going on, but that is the effect that it has. Secondarily, we have what is called the activation effect. And so for those folks that are supporting their party as a whole and then supporting this candidate as a whole, the candidate wants to, of course, have an impact on them that gets them engaged in their campaign. So they're trying to excite the voting base in their party to, one, talk to other people about them, two, donate money to their campaign. Three, maybe donate time and effort to their campaign, become a volunteer. So they're trying to speak to their party members and to get them uh, actively involved, not just as a voter in the primary, but as someone that's going to support the campaign for party members all the way through the campaign process and provide that time and that money, that volunteer effort um, that will help sustain a campaign and will help see a candidate to a victory within their party. So this is the second most common thing that we see coming out of the campaign process. Um, what a lot of us probably had as our primary picture here was what we call the conversion impact of campaigning. And conversion means that you've changed someone's mind about yourself as a candidate, right? That they were either committed to no candidate or maybe committed to another candidate, and you, right, presented a good enough picture, an understanding of who you are and what your party was and how you as a party member were going to be working forward for the party. And you convinced these people to change their mind, to get them involved, right? To move from one party perspective to another, or to move from a non-committed state to a committed state for them, right? Um, this is actually what happens the least. It's the hardest thing to do. Conversion is not something that uh, happens quickly or easily. And so it's for candidates to be successful in actively converting people from being a non-participant or being an antagonist for the other party means that they've got to do a lot of work to make this happen. This is not something that happens easily. And on this slide, we see several reasons why that is the case. For most of us that are, that are might be voters in a general election, but are debatable whether we're going to be voters in a primary and whether, uh, we're going to actually even get to the polls. We're not paying attention. If we're not a stalwart party member, someone that's looking to support the party already, most of us in the primary season are not paying attention. And so there's no chance of conversion if the person you're trying to convince to vote for you isn't paying attention to the campaign, right? And so you've got to overcome that blasé perspective and get them energetic and involved and paying attention. And that's a very difficult thing to do, to get people up off their seats and get them involved. Um, we also have a psychological component here that humans tend to employ that makes it difficult to
I'm
convert.
about to go walk and listen to the class right now.
It's gonna be 90. It's not a lot right now. It'll be good.
Somebody
Okay. All
needs
right.
to
I was about to say,
It's
Renault.
gonna be done.
read,
Okay.
please
I'll
mute.
be in 5 hours.
I'll mute you. Um, okay, where was that? Selective perception. Yes. So most of us, right, if we have a perspective already, we have a belief, we have a party that we support, opposition party isn't going to get the opportunity to convert us because we exercise selective perception. When we see something coming to us or at us that is coming from a perspective we disagree with, don't like, don't want to hear about it, right? We just don't listen. We don't engage. And I think this is probably something that's become a lot easier to actually exercise in the last 30, 40, 50 years because we get so many different media messages, so much right coming at us all the time. We actually become fairly expert at just closing off anything right that's interrupting us, much less paying attention to what the topic is and saying, "Oh, I need to listen to this opposition message to see if I need to change my mind." We don't really do that. Um, right? We kind of get into our own little media bubbles, and so the opportunity for us to have our minds changed is shrinking, I think, given the way the media works and the way that we engage with media in the last few years. I think the other thing that goes on here with selective perception is tied more to something like the idea of well, I'll just think about this for a second. You're in a debate slash argument with someone trying to prove your point. And you're overmatched, right? Or you're wrong, right? The person that you're arguing with is getting the better of you. They know more about the topic. They are right if it's a factual argument. Um, how many of you, right, at the point you realize this is going the wrong way, do you disengage, right? Um, or double down, right? I can tell you, right, I've been married a very, very long time, and sometimes, right, you get in an argument, and it's like, I'm not going to lose, even when you realize you're wrong, right? You're going to come up with something, you're going to change the argument, you're going to push the topic, right? But you're not going to admit that you're wrong and change your position. It is a very difficult thing for humans, I think, to take those steps that would be a conversion step, a changing of the side. So it takes you recognizing first that you're wrong, and two, having enough self-confidence to be able to admit that and change your position. And we don't like to do that. People don't like to admit they're wrong. They don't like to change their position. They would, for the most part, it would seem, rather just stop the conversation and say, well, I can't even talk with you or something. And so I think this is kind of an element of that selective perception as well, that, right, when we get in those positions, a lot of time where maybe a candidate is presenting good data, good facts, a good argument that, hey, we're going to do better on these issues over here, and you should support us. the fact that it's going to probably require us, to be converted, right, would require us to admit that we were in the wrong place to begin with, right, on that issue or whatever, and that this candidate has shown us the light. Well, that's certainly possible. It does happen, but it doesn't happen as much as you'd like to think it does. And I think if you reflect on your own experience, probably you'll go, oh yeah, converting me is going to be tough, right? And every candidate knows that, but uh, so having that is probably a psychological fact out there means that candidates really need to put most of their effort into educating their own folks about who they are and what they're doing, motivating their own folks, activating them, right, supporting their message to them, and then work. If you're being successful there, then you can also work the conversion angle. But your expectation is probably right. Um, More of one of activating your own party, engaging your own party, trying to get them to show up and vote during the election. And if you catch some folks from the other side, convert some folks from the other side, that's a bonus. Um, and if you were going to spend more time, effort, and money outside your party trying to engage people, you should probably spend it working toward the independents that don't have a commitment to a political party, right? You should probably, because that's not much of a conversion there, right? You're looking at people who say, I'm an independent slash I'm undecided. Well, that's an easier argument to make, an easier persuasion to put into place than try to get somebody to come to your side. So you can convert people. It's not impossible, but as a candidate, it's probably a lot more effective to focus on engaging your own party and making sure they show up to the elections, and then right engaging with those folks that aren't committed. That's a lot easier process. And to be fair, that non-committed group um, is getting larger and larger in the United States and the independent states, right? When you look down into the state levels, that group of people who do not identify with either the Democratic or Republican Party is growing. And in some cases, it looks to be maybe as high as 40% of the voting electorate, those folks that actually show up at the polls. So if you're a candidate, once you've solidified your party supporters, you might ought to go after these folks in the middle, these independents, because we're seeing a marked decline in party identification for both parties, both major parties. It's been happening for 15, 20 years now, at least. And where we used to have about 15 to 20% of the population say they were independents and not siding with any party or the other, we're closer, pushing into high 30s and closer to 40% of the voters saying that. And a good number of them are folks that believe their political perspective has not changed, but their parties have, right? That their Democratic Party has become more progressive, or that the Republican Party that they used to identify with has become more far right leaning and extremist leaning and from that perspective. And so in either case, you find, right, this larger group of voters in the middle, right, growing because of a decline of party identification, because they don't think their party represents them well. And we'll talk when we get to the political party chapter more about what it is that's going on within the independent parties uh, that's causing that. But for a campaign or a nomination process, a candidate needs to be acutely aware that while they may not have much impact on the election at the primary level with these folks that have uh, claimed their parties left them, right, that move between the nomination campaign and the election campaign, right, where you win the nomination in March or April in Texas, April if it's a runoff probably, and then you've got that run up to the general election in November. This is probably the focus group that you're going after as a candidate. The other reason that it's hard to convert people from one candidate to another is that quite often one of the candidates that is running for election is actually running for re-election, right? They're an incumbent, and incumbents have a lot of advantages over challengers. Um, Now, in this, um, we're looking at this Texas Senate election that I've been referencing. We really don't have any uh, challengers that are true challengers, ones that are coming out of nowhere, and this is their first time in the election process. As I said, all four of these folks have served in politics, are serving in politics as they went through there. So we didn't see this, but you're going to have right. The incumbent in the senatorial election is John Cornyn. He's been there for a good long while. He's looking to keep his seat representing the Republican Party at the U.S. level for the state of Texas. And so in that case, right, there's not really an incumbent that's going to be having these advantages in this particular election. But if we had um, a true challenger, right, that incumbent would hold these advantages. One, um, a distinct advantage in name recognition because they're already in office. They've already been elected once. If people are paying attention to politics, they probably know who their representatives are in government. So um, John Cornyn should have more name recognition than any of the rest of these candidates, and probably does. The fact that his opponent in the primary is Attorney General for state of Texas and an Attorney General that's been in the news a lot, kind of negates that. If Cornyn wins his primary as an incumbent and goes into the general election, he's facing Tallarico, who is a Texas House member, House representative, and has been there for a little bit. And so um, he'll have an incumbent advantage, a name recognition advantage there because he's already won an election that was statewide. But Tallarico, right, is an, a candidate that has excited the media, excited the press, and been getting a lot of time. So it's not going to be as big uh, an advantage on the name recognition as it would be for most. Uh, New candidates for office, right, ones that have not been elected before, tend to have to spend most of the money they raise on just getting voters to know who they are, right? So the fact that an incumbent already has name recognition means they don't spend a lot of money on that. They skip that part and they move forward to spending money on talking about what their policies are and attacking their opposition. They're not having to build a case of, hey, look at me, here's my name, here's what I'm trying to do. Hope you remember me, kind of thing. Incumbents generally don't have to worry about that. The second thing, actually, I'm going to move down to the third element and come back. The third element is that incumbents have already raised money and been successful at it and have been in office for a while. So they can keep, while they're in office, raising money, building what we call their political war chest. Whereas a new candidate is probably starting from zero, right? And they're having to build just an initial bits of money. And so they're spending a lot of time, right, trying to get people to know who they are and then give them money. The incumbent, for however long they've been in office, has been able to keep, right, receiving money from people who know who they are because they're in office. And when they ramp up their campaign, it's usually easier to raise that money, to raise more money. The other thing here, too, is that quite often the money that's coming to a candidate is being funneled through their particular political party. And so if you're an incumbent, you've been working with your party for however long you've been in office. They've already submitted money and time and effort to you. And that's going to keep going because, hey, you're an incumbent and they want to keep you there. Whereas a challenger, their party is going to be looking at all of their candidates and deciding, does this person have a chance? Should we spend the dollars that we have on this new challenger to an incumbent, and can they possibly win? We know the odds are against them, right? So the money is harder to come by. The second element on here is the track record, right? When you're in office as an incumbent, you have generated a history, right? You've been there for a while. You've done things, and if you are paying attention to your constituents while you're in office, you have tried to make sure that you have done things that have helped your constituents, that have made a good case for your state, if you're running for Senate, or your district, if you're running for something smaller. So your constituents should have some idea of what you've been doing. You've got a track record. And you can point to that track record and say, I have done these things. I have voted on these bills. I have submitted these bills for consideration and argued for them. And so you have a track record of actual history that you've done. Whereas a challenger's probably doesn't have that. What a challenger has is a promise, right? And so track records versus promises, one carries a lot more clout, certainly. So incumbents have this decided advantage over new challengers. Again, the current election process we're in, this has been blunted a little bit because of the different candidates that we have out there. One other thing I'll say about candidates, incumbents, is that most incumbents win, right? And so they're they win they've already won once or twice, and they're incumbents. And the track record of incumbents running for reelection is very strong. They do get reelected. And that's an easier case to make for people that you're asking to part with their money, right? You can say, look, the odds are in my favor of winning. If you want your dollars to make a difference, I'm the candidate to support. So let's talk about these money and media and marketing, how that leads to momentum. In this process, right, you're trying to, as a candidate, build, right, a base of supporters. And some of those people that you're trying to build up are volunteers that you're convincing to give their time and hopefully their money, right, to your campaign. Others are ones that you're going to hire that are professionals. They're going to help you build a campaign, build a strategy, spend your money, raise your money, right? So there's going to be this work on the different elements of people as a campaign resource, and you're going to have to both hire the best you can hire and convince the most that you can to give their limited time and effort, right, as volunteers. The next step in that is to generate this campaign flow of cash, right? You've got to have it. We have very little politically supported or governmentally supported campaign funds. There's some at the national level to support presidential campaigns. You're not going to see money coming into state elections from the federal government, right? The monies that are donated to political campaigning at the national level go to those presidential campaigns. If the candidates accept that money and accept the things that the restrictions going along with it. So, other than the office of president, right, we're really running these campaigns off of private money. And by private, I mean non-governmental, non-tax money, right? So you're looking for people and parties and interest groups and corporations and to be resources for the cash you need to fund your campaign. And these things are expensive, right? We're spending, millions and millions of dollars in campaigns individual campaigns within the state of Texas. And so, it is no surprise that you're going to go as a candidate where the money is to try to get what you need to run your campaign and be successful in your campaign. And that means right, the wealthy have a distinct advantage in this sense because with long and expensive campaigns, right, it's a priority, right, for you to as a candidate get to the where the money is, and that means you got to go talk to these wealthy folks, or your campaign has to go talk to them and convince them, right, to support your case. And a lot of us probably have the perspective that people that are elected to office are, in a sense, captured by the wealthy donors or interests that put money into their campaigns. And we certainly do have evidence that public policy that comes out of government at the federal, state, and local levels tends to track pretty well with what the moneyed interests are trying to get out of government, right? So I won't go so far as to say that politicians are bought and paid for. Some certainly are, but all of them, right, because of the nature of how we do our campaigns, the length of them, the cost of them, all of them are somewhat obligated or feel obligated to look after the interest of where the money comes from. And that's just common sense, right? So um, you're going to combat this only by trying to probably come up with some way to uh, publicly fund campaigns. That's the only way you're probably going to get this, right? And we obviously, in the United States and Texas in particular, don't look too fondly on using taxes to raise money to fund people's political campaigns, right? So um, the odds of that happening are pretty slim, which means the system we're in is going to have us see our candidates necessarily go to where the money is and speak to those special interests and try to explain to them how their position is commiserate with the position of those donors. There's just, right, it's common sense. There's no real way around it. Politics runs on money. And so the folks that have the money are going to have the impact, a good impact on politics. Now, that being said, the election is still the mechanism that puts you in office. Uh, so, right, you do need to be paying attention to your constituents, the people that actually voted for you. If you don't do that and do that fairly well, the odds of you being a successful reelected incumbent go down, obviously, right? If you're alienating your voting block. So, uh, right, you've got to walk this line between the voters and the donors. Now, I mentioned publicly funded campaigns, right? We kind of have a little bit of this if candidates opt into it in the presidential elections. Um, but if we look at it from a state perspective, there's some good things that could come out of it and some things that would concern us. One, right, it would, if we had a process where, tax money was used to fund the campaigns, political campaigns of candidates and um, right, that would possibly, right, lower the dependence that candidates have on the wealthy, on the donors, on special interest, right? Um, because they wouldn't be required to go for them to fund their campaigns. So that would certainly tend to make candidates maybe a little more independent of what's going on the money side of their things. This might encourage more participation, voluntary participation, because we would see candidates that are not wed to their interest necessarily, right? Candidates could more often veer away from the wealthy and the donor class and try to right argue for what's best for the people of Texas. It would probably only work or would be limited to general elections, right? The ones where we're actually choosing between party members and who's going to take office at the end. The primary process, right, is a process, an election process that is grounded based, right, developed out of the political parties. So your primaries are still going to be something like that, where you've got to kind of be a committed party member to vote in that election, support a candidate, and the candidate's going to have to appeal to that party. The other thing this does is by potentially by bringing down the reliance on donor class, wealthy money. Um, Someone other than Democrats and Republicans might be able to put together a strong campaign, right? Uh, Third parties that we often refer to as on the fringe might become, right, probably, if we look to other countries as an example, probably would become more pertinent parties. People would think that they're more electable because you've gotten out of this two choice majority party system that we use here. So in that sense, public funding uh, could open up some interesting opportunities. Um, Concerns that we would have with it, right, is that one, a dominant party in a state, right, a state that's like Texas, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, one where that has a dominant party that's running and winning in all the statewide elections. You might start seeing the state, who is going to be responsible for collecting this money and organizing this money. Um, right, the party that's in charge of the state's going to probably be the party that's running how we do this process, and that could certainly, right, tilt things to the favor of that dominant party that's in office. Whatever rules or processes or policies or regulations that come into place about how to raise public funds and how those funds get disseminated out to candidates is going to be determined by the parties that are in power and passing the laws about the publicly funded campaigns. You'd also see probably a very strong backlash from committed citizens, and by that I mean citizens committed to a particular political perspective and or party, because right, we don't want to be taxed and then see our tax dollars goes to things that we wouldn't support. And so just generally speaking. And so knowing that your tax money, if say you're a committed Democrat, your tax money that's coming out of this is going to end up supporting Republicans or other political party candidates that to run against your candidate, you're not going to like that. It still also doesn't get rid of special interest. It doesn't get rid of donors. It doesn't get rid of the donor class or the wealthy class. It just pushes it out of the general election and into the parties and into the primaries. Um, so in that case, it's still a problem, right? We're not going to get there. Um, and frankly, it could act to suppress, right, what the parties stand for and what candidates stand for. Um, and it could still be a problem. A particular type of campaigning that I want to talk about is negative campaigning. This is campaigning where candidates don't go out and present who they are and the policies they support. This is campaigning where campaigns are meant to tear down the opposition, right? It's not my esteemed colleague over here that I'm competing against is a good person, but I've got better policies, right? That's good. That's positive, right? Where we see my policies versus your policies. Negative campaigning is real ugly. It's almost always personal, and it has a deleterious or corrosive effect on the voting population. If we're a hardcore committed Democrat or Republican, uh, we're probably loving to see negative campaigning against the opposition party and the opposition candidates. But if you're not committed, and 40% of us might not be, this kind of looks like this schoolyard name calling, right? Um, if you're not a committed voter, you're trying to figure out who these candidates are and which ones deserve your support. Seeing the name calling and the gotcha moments that come out of negative campaigning tend to turn people off. They're not looking for that. Um, and what they're looking for is a candidate to tell them, hey, I'm a member of this party. My party believes XYZ. I support XYZ, or maybe I don't. I support something a little different. But here's who I am as a candidate, and here's what I want to do. Right? We're trying to figure out who we want to vote for. Whereas negative campaign is trying to collapse the campaign and collapse the personal perspective of the opposition, right, to make them unelectable. Um, and frankly, it's we when we look at this and we examine negative campaigning, a large bit of that negative campaigning is, if not outright lies, at least heavily stretched, inaccurate accusations. Um, right? We see fear-based campaigns. We see, the gotchas that, oh, they said this one little phrase, and now we can turn that into something, right? Take it out of context and turn it into something that paints them in a bad picture. And voters were, you know, we like to think that this doesn't impact us as voters, that this kind of negative stuff rolls off our back. But our research tells us again and again and again that negative campaigning is effective, right? And so people remember that easier, right? When you slam somebody, that slam uh, stays with you, especially if it's something that is already speaking to the choir, right? So um, the type of media that you run, the type of campaigning that you run, is important. And unfortunately, negative campaigning seems to be more effective than positive campaigning. Um, when you throw in the fact that um, these campaigns will turn so negative, will turn so divisive, you actually have a lot of good candidates that just don't want to put up with that. Right? They don't want their campaign to be taken up by spending a lot of time having to explain away attacks from the opposition, having to go back and say that's not what I said. Right? If you look at the whole scope of my argument, this is certainly not it, and it's being misrepresented. Um, and in that sense, right, this negative campaigning puts candidates on the defensive more often than they need to be. Certainly, right, their background and history of a candidate should be understood and brought up and is relevant um, to a campaign, right? But the focus should be most of the time, if this person gets in office, how are they going to represent us? What are they going to do for us? And negative campaigning tends to focus on the candidate and not the policy. And so it takes us away from looking at what, right, these individuals who are going to be working with a group, right, their party, right, when they get into office, it puts the focus or the onus on that individual than on what the party's going to do. And we need to be aware of both. And candidates, right, good candidates quite often just say, you know what, it's not worth my time, it's not worth my money to get beat up for a year or a year and a half in public, just so that I can maybe get into politics. But there are a lot easier, quieter ways to influence politics than becoming a candidate. And the other thing is negative campaigning turns off the voters, right? And sometimes that's actually the point of it. But voters, right, get tired of hearing this. They get tired of all the negative campaigns, and it um, just right puts them in a position where they just throw their hands up and say, you know what? I can't support any of them. They're all attacking each other. It's all ugly. I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to be engaged anymore. It's a terrible thing. And so they back out and they just get turned off by politics, and now they're not even not paying attention to campaigns and elections. They're just not voting. And so a lot of this part of campaigning that's really bad for the whole process. And in that sense, I think the upshot that we take away from negative campaigning is that it's actually bad for democracy, right? Anything that's going on that's going to discourage people from paying attention to the political message and paying attention to the policy message, and turns people sour on both the political process and the election process. That's a bad thing for democracy, right? We need uh, good elections, strong elections. We need people participating. We need for democracy to be strong, you need people to get into the elections to go vote. And so anything like this that would limit that and turn that down and turn people away is bad for democracy as a whole. Um, so Texas, our primary elections, when do they happen? We're referred to in Texas as a Super Tuesday state. Um, And Super Tuesday is a date when there's a good number of states that all have their primaries on that day, Super Tuesday, which is the second Tuesday in March in even numbered years, right? So we're looking here, right? We just had uh, ours in this March, right? We'll have it again in 2 more years. Um, and so we have a lot of primaries that happen here. We have a lot of elections, party elections that are going on, and candidates getting selected by this. And so um, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to other states during the primary process when there's not a presidential election going on. So, like if you're paying attention in Texas, right from November through March. Not a whole lot that takes our view outside of Texas candidates and outside of Texas policy. Um, the fact that we do have a president now that is making active uh, comments and supports for who they support and who they don't support down in state elections. Um, that's a little bit new, and it can bring some national party politics and perspective down into our off year elections like we had this year. Obviously, when there's a presidential campaign on the ballot, um, then we're looking at how the president's doing, and the incumbent, the challenger, and such. The presidential campaign's going from state to state to state as we see, right, that behind the scenes delegate process kind of telling us who's going to possibly win the vote. So there's more focus on Super Tuesday state to state when we've got a presidential election. Those off election years like this year where there's no presidential election, the focus is going to be within the state. And so we don't really refer to that as a Super Tuesday anymore. Right, it's each state looking at their own. But a lot of effort comes out of these primary elections across the states and in Texas. Um, so let's talk about, as I foreshadowed earlier, we'll talk about the types of primaries there are. Um, right, we talked a little bit about caucuses already, but primaries, right? The form of a primary is dependent upon the state laws that primary is held in. And so Texas state law sets up Texas as what we call an open primary state. Two other types of primaries out there, a blanket primary and a closed primary. Um, so let's start at the bottom and work our way back up. The closed primary is probably the easiest to understand. When you as a citizen go to register to vote in a state that runs closed primaries, they're going to be in some form or fashion asking you to declare what party you identify with. Um, so if you're in a closed primary state and you fill out your registration card, probably what they're going to do is have you select the party, you know, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Liberal, whatever the case may be. And that selection determines what you can do during a primary election. So if you're in a closed primary state and you said, "Hey, you check the box that says I'm a Republican. When you show up to the primaries, they're going to look at your information, see that you check that box, and they're going to hand you a Republican Party primary ballot because you made that choice right when you registered. You said this is the party I associate with. In an open primary state, you skip that first process when you're registering of indicating what party you belong to. And so in an open primary state like Texas, when you show up to the polls, right, you have to have been registered. You show up to the polls, they're going to ask you, which primary do you want to participate in? And so we call this an open primary because we let the voter choose at the time they're going to vote which primary they want to vote. So let's say personally, if I identified as a Republican here in Texas, right, with an open primary, I could be looking at the Republican primary and going, all of the folks that I support for office in the Republican Party are incumbents or favored to win, and my vote's probably not going to matter. So I'll vote in the Democratic primary, and I will cast votes to try to pick what I think are the candidates for the Democratic Party that can be easily defeated by my Republicans in the general election, right? So the open primary, that that design that we have here that lets you choose which primary to participate in at the point of being in the voting area means you can watch the politics all the way up to the time you get to vote and decide where you want to go with your primary vote. Whereas in a closed primary system, you tell the state where you are at the point you register, and that's the ballot you're going to get. All right, so that's, and most of the states in the United States are either closed or open. There is a third type of primary called a blanket primary. And a blanket primary, I think the only state that uses it is Louisiana. And that is essentially everybody that is a candidate for office, regardless of what party they belong to, is all on one ballot. You don't declare or have to declare that you're a Democrat or Republican. You don't have to choose a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot. You're registered in Louisiana. You show up to the poll. They give you the one ballot and everybody's on it. And you pick and choose how you want to move through that process. And you might pick a Republican in this primary for this office and a Democrat in a different for a different office, right? And so you can work back and forth. And so essentially, the blanket primary is the same as a general election, where everybody's on the ballot, right? Except now you have everybody, which is multiple people in the parties, all on the ballot at the front end. And so you get to a lot more choice as a voter that way. So most of the states are either closed or open. Texas is an open, and Louisiana does their own thing with the blanket primary. Um, so these type of primary elections, right? Texas has tended to hold them always in March. Um, the one that we just concluded, right, in this month, was what we refer to as a non-presidential year primary. Texas reserves in its state law to have it at a different time than March, and sometimes we've had them in May. But generally speaking, we've tended to stay in the March timeframe with our primaries. Once the primaries are over, right, we're going to have a general election 6 months later in November. We have general elections in even numbered years in November, and the winners take office right in January of that odd number year that a couple months later. Our general elections are held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in the calendar in the month of November. And so what we're trying to ensure, right, is that we have a a day, right, that we've circled on the calendar that we have laid out there and we know it's coming. It's predictable. It's good for democracy that we know when those elections are going to happen. Um, and so, first Tuesday after the first Monday in Texas will be our election in November. Quite often it ends up being early in the month, but it can be the full second week of the month. Um, this November, right, is what we refer to as an off-year election, and so we will be right having our governor be elected in November of this year. 2 years from now will be a presidential year election, so we'll be having presidents elected in November. So Texas has intentionally staggered the executive elections so that we're electing a governor in the years in the even numbered years where we're not electing a president. And the idea behind this was having these kind of bigger, more well-known elections and campaigns will hopefully stir people interest and get them there. And so we've put the governor election in off year to try to keep participation rates higher right during that time. The other thing to know is that general elections um, are right managed by all of the states. The U.S. Constitution says that the independent states are responsible for running all of the elections, whether those are federal elections or state elections. Right, it's going to be the state law that sets the timing, the state law that sets registration, the state law that says how you're going to uh, so hold those primaries and those general elections, how you're going to handle the ballots, then the boxes after that, how you're going to do the counts and the recounts, right? All of that's determined by state law. So it varies state to state how you do it and what the legal process is. And this is right in the U.S. Constitution that this is a power reserved for the states as a way of ensuring the states manage something that has a direct, immediate impact on the federal system. And so Texas is responsible for all the elections that happen here. Uh, oops. Okay. We got about 5 minutes left. It's a good place to stop. Are there any questions from today? I haven't seen anything popping up on the chat, so um, if not, let's call it a day and we'll close this out and I'll talk to you guys again on Wednesday. Also, make sure you check your syllabus for due dates, right? You've got both paper due date coming up and not too far off and another exam. So be aware of where we are and where we're going. I'll talk to you guys on Wednesday.